You don't expect your life to derail over a bruised bag of Granny Smith apples. Ella was just tired. Her feet ached, her coat was soaked, and the old man struggling at the crosswalk was holding up the bus. She didn't help him out of some noble, bleeding heart instinct. She did it because she wanted to go home. 24 hours later, 4 men in tailored suits parked themselves at the cramped tables of her cafe. They weren't there for coffee. The copper kettle smelled like burnt milk and industrial bleach. It was a stubborn, clinging scent that Ella couldn't scrub out of the chipped linoleum, no matter how hard she leaned into the mop. It was 8:15 p.m. on a Tuesday. The rain outside was relentless, a freezing sideways drizzle that turned the city pavements into slick mirrors, reflecting the neon glow of the liquor store across the street. Ella locked the front door, the deadbolt engaging with a satisfying heavy clack. She leaned her forehead against the cool glass for a fraction of a second, letting the ambient hum of the street wash over her. Her lower back throbbed. A phantom burning sensation traced the line of a grease burn she'd gotten on her forearm 3 hours ago during the dinner rush. She was 28, but on nights like this, she felt a hollow, marrow-deep exhaustion that belonged to someone decades older. She pulled her thin trench coat tighter around herself and stepped out into the biting wind. The bus stop was 3 blocks away, a miserable stretch of cracked concrete, poorly lit by flickering street lamps. That was when she saw him. He was an older man, slight and frail-looking, under a tweed flat cap standing at the edge of the curb. The rain was plastering a thin windbreaker to his hunched shoulders. In his arms he clutched 2 overstuffed brown paper grocery bags. They were soaked through the structural integrity of the paper, dissolving by the second. Ella paused. She felt the immediate cynical spike of urban self-preservation. Keep walking. You have a bus to catch. You have $22 in your checking account until Friday. You don't have time to be a good Samaritan. Just as she made the conscious decision to avert her eyes and march past, the bottom of the man's left bag gave out. It wasn't dramatic, just a wet, tearing sound, followed by the heavy consecutive thuds of oranges cans of soup and a plastic-wrapped package of ground beef hitting the muddy pavement. One of the oranges rolled lazily into the gutter, bobbing in the filthy stream of runoff water. The old man froze, staring down at the mess with a look of profound, quiet defeat. He didn't curse. He just let out a slow, rattling sigh that Ella heard over the hiss of passing tires. "Damn it," Ella muttered. She didn't say it with affection. She said it with the deep, resentful annoyance of someone whose conscience had just violently overridden her exhaustion. She stepped off her path, her worn boots splashing through a puddle, and crouched beside him. "Don't try to pick the paper up, it's just going to shred," she said. Her voice sharp, stripped of any customer service warmth. The man blinked at her. Up close, his face was a map of deep, weathered lines. His eyes, though, were a sharp, startlingly clear blue. He smelled faintly of damp wool peppermint lozenges and something metallic like old coins. "The bottom fell out," he said. His voice was a rasp, thick with a subtle accent Ella couldn't quite place. "I saw." Ella grabbed the intact items, the soup cans, a box of tea, and shoved them into the deep pockets of her trench coat. The cold metal pressed uncomfortably against her ribs. She picked up the ground beef and held it in her left hand. "Where's your other bag? Give it here before that one bursts, too." "I am perfectly capable." "You're shaking," Ella interrupted, snatching the second precarious bag from his arms. The damp paper instantly began tearing under the weight of glass jars. She adjusted her grip, hooking her arms underneath it, letting the sharp corner of what felt like a pickle jar dig into her sternum. "Where are you going?" The old man stared at her hands, then up at her face. He didn't look grateful. He looked intensely curious, studying her as if she were a puzzle he'd found on the street. 3 blocks east, a brownstone on the corner of Elm. Fine, let's go. Walk close to the buildings, the awnings will block some of the rain. They walked in silence. The bag was agonizingly heavy. Ella's forearms burned, the muscles trembling in protest. The wet paper disintegrated further, forcing her to continually shift her grip, her knuckles turning white. She regretted this instantly. She could have been on the heated bus by now. "You work at the cafe," the old man stated. It wasn't a question. "I own it." "Well, the bank owns it. I just scrub the floors." "A hard business. Margins are thin. You're telling me." Ella gritted her teeth as a jar shifted, threatening to break through the side. "Watch the curb here." When they finally reached the brownstone, a pristine, aggressively expensive piece of real estate that stood out starkly against the surrounding decay, Ella didn't wait for a thank you. She awkwardly dumped the surviving bag onto the covered porch, pulled the cans and tea from her pockets, and stacked them neatly on top. "There," she panted, wiping rain and stray coffee grounds from her forehead with the back of a damp, cold hand. The old man reached into his coat pocket. "Let me compensate you for your—" "Don't." Ella snapped a bit harsher than she intended. She was wet, she was freezing, and the offer of a few crumpled bills felt vaguely insulting, though she couldn't articulate why. "Just double bag the heavy stuff next time." She turned on her heel and walked away. She didn't look back. If she had, she would have noticed that the frail old man wasn't fumbling for keys. He was standing perfectly still, watching her retreat into the darkness as a massive black luxury sedan quietly pulled up to the curb beside him. At 5:30 the next morning, Ella was a machine, operating purely on muscle memory and spite. The cafe was empty. The air was thick with the rich, bitter aroma of freshly ground espresso and the sugary scent of day-old muffins. She was currently marking down by 50%. She wiped down the espresso machine, her mind cycling through a familiar, anxiety-inducing mental spreadsheet: flower delivery on Thursday. Rent due on the 1st. The gasket on group head 2 needs replacing. At exactly 6 a.m., she reached over to flip the open sign in the window. Before her fingers even brushed the plastic, she noticed the cars. 2 identical matte black SUVs were parked illegally in the loading zone, directly outside her large storefront window. They looked heavy-armored and entirely out of place on a street dominated by rusted hatchbacks and delivery trucks. Ella paused, a prickle of unease working its way up her spine. Maybe it was a drug raid next door. The neighborhood wasn't exactly known for its choir boys. Then the doors of the SUVs opened. 4 men stepped out onto the sidewalk. They moved with a synchronized heavy grace that immediately made the hair on Ella's arms stand up. They weren't cops. Cops wore cheap suits or uniforms and carried their exhaustion in their shoulders. These men wore tailored wool that looked like it cost more than Ella's annual revenue. They were broad, imposing, and moved with a casual, terrifying ownership of the space around them. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully, a jarring sound, as the 4 men walked into the copper kettle. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The cafe, which normally felt comfortably cramped, suddenly felt suffocatingly small. They didn't fan out like men looking for a threat. They moved directly to the 4 two-seater tables against the far wall, Ella's prime seating. They sat down. 2 faced the door. 2 faced the windows. None of them looked at the menu board. Ella stood frozen behind the counter, the damp rag still clutched in her hand. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird rhythm. Harass debt collectors? Did her ex-boyfriend borrow money from the wrong people again? Panic tasted like copper at the back of her throat. The largest of the 4, a man with close-cropped dark hair, a broken nose that had healed slightly off-center, and eyes the color of wet slate, stood up and approached the counter. Ella instinctively took a half-step back, bumping into the pastry display. The man stopped. He didn't lean on the counter. He kept his hands visible, resting at his sides. The faint smell of expensive sandalwood and clean gun oil drifted across the register. 4 black coffees, he said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone, flat, transactional. Ella managed her throat, painfully dry. Sure, just regular drip. Yes. Ella turned her back to him, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the paper cups. She forced herself to breathe. They're just buying coffee. Just pour the coffee. The sound of the hot liquid hitting the cardboard seemed deafeningly loud in the silent shop. She placed the 4 cups on the counter, snapping lids onto them with more force than necessary. That'll be $12. The man reached inside his jacket. Ella flinched, bracing herself, but he only pulled out a slim leather wallet. He extracted a crisp, uncreased $100 bill and laid it flat on the counter. Keep the change, he said. I don't have change for 100 this early, Ella said, her cynical edge slicing through her fear. She pushed the bill back toward him. It's $12. The man looked at the bill, then at her. A flicker of something amusement irritation crossed his stoic face. He didn't take the money back. Consider it rent, he said calmly, for the tables. Ella frowned, the fear momentarily eclipsed by confusion. Rent, you can't just rent tables. If it gets busy, paying customers need those seats. It won't get busy, the man said. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. He took the cardboard tray of coffees, turned, and walked back to his table. The 4 men sat in silence. They didn't touch their phones. They didn't talk to each other. They just sat, sipping their coffee, their eyes scanning the street, outside, and the door. Ella stood behind the counter, staring at the $100 bill. The espresso machine hissed, purging a puff of white steam into the quiet air. The realization settled over her like a lead blanket. They weren't here to shake her down. They were guarding the place. But why, by 10 a.m., the man's prediction had come true? The Copper Kettle was a ghost town. Normally, the mid-morning rush brought in a steady stream of nursing students from the nearby clinic, exhausted mechanics and local retirees. Today, people walked up to the glass door, peered inside, saw the 4 stone-faced gargoyles in $1,000 suits, and immediately turned around. Mrs. Gable, an 80-year-old woman who came in every Tuesday for a chamomile tea, actually opened the door, took one look at the man with the broken nose, whispered, "Oh dear Lord," and scurried away faster than Ella thought, physically possible for someone with a double hip replacement. Ella was losing money. The $100 bill on the counter was a drop in the bucket compared to the foot traffic she was bleeding. Frustration, hot and jagged, began to burn away the edges of her anxiety. She was a woman who had fought tooth and nail for every square inch of this mediocre existence. She worked 70-hour weeks. She burned her hands. She dealt with broken plumbing and bounced checks. She did not have the luxury of letting 4 mobsters, because, let's be real, she knew exactly what they were, by now scare away her livelihood. She grabbed an aluminum bus tub and marched out from behind the counter. She clattered it loudly onto the table. Next to the men began aggressively wiping down the already clean laminate surface. "You're scaring my customers," she said loudly, not looking at them, scrubbing a phantom coffee ring with vicious intent. The 4 men didn't flinch. 3 of them ignored her entirely. The lead man, the one who had paid, slowly turned his head to look at her. "We are not interfering with your business," he said mildly. Ella stopped scrubbing. She threw the damp rag into the tub. It made a wet, slapping sound. Interfering. Are you kidding me? A woman just crossed herself before backing out the door. You look like you're waiting for a hit to go down. People want a blueberry muffin, not to be collateral damage. The man's jaw tightened slightly. My name is Leo, and we are here to ensure there is no collateral damage to you or this establishment. Ella crossed her arms, her apron stained with flour and milk, staring down a man who could likely snap her neck with one hand. She didn't feel brave. She felt tired and pissed off, which in her experience usually looked a lot like bravery from the outside. Who sent you? She demanded. I don't owe money. I don't pay protection. I can barely afford the exterminator. If this is a shakedown, you picked the wrong zip code. Leo sighed. It was a very subtle exhalation, the sound of a professional forced to deal with an unpredictable civilian. He leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on the table. The fabric of his suit strained across his shoulders. Do you remember the man you assisted last night on the corner of 4th and Mercer? Ella blinked. The image of the frail man in the rain, the torn paper bag, the smell of peppermint and wet wool flashed in her mind. The old guy with the soup. One of the other guards let out a sound that might have been a stifled cough or a laugh. Leo shot him a freezing glare, and the man went perfectly still. That old guy, Leo said, turning his slate-grey eyes back to Ella, is Albert Moretti. The name dropped between them like a brick. Ella didn't run in criminal circles, but she lived in the city. You didn't live in this city without knowing the name Moretti. It was synonymous with shipping unions, high-end real estate development, and the kind of quiet, violent power that kept the police chiefs looking the other way. Ella felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her skin cold and clammy. The Moretti family? Yes. I carried groceries for a mob boss. Former boss, Leo corrected smoothly. He is retired. He enjoys walking. He insists on doing his own shopping, much to the distress of his son. His son? Ella's voice sounded hollow in her own ears. Dominic Moretti, the current head, the man the local news only mentioned in careful, legally vetted euphemisms. His son, Leo, confirmed. Dominic was displeased that his father was caught in the rain unaccompanied. However, he was extremely grateful to the woman who ensured his father made it home safely when his detail temporarily lost sight of him. His detail? Ella repeated the absurdity of the situation, bubbling up into a sharp, incredulous laugh. You guys lost an 80-year-old man in a thunderstorm. Leo's expression darkened, a flash of genuine shame crossing his features before the stoic mask slammed back into place. It was a logistical error, one that is being rectified. The point, Miss Ella, is that Dominic Moretti honors a debt. You protected the family. The family now protects you. Ella stared at him, her chest heaving, the sheer suffocating arrogance of it. I don't need protection. I helped a guy carry some cans of minestrone. I didn't take a bullet for him. You being here is ruining my business. With respect, ma'am, Leo said, his tone indicating zero respect and absolute finality. Mr. Moretti gave us an order. We do not leave this cafe unattended until he says otherwise. We will stay out of your way. But we are not leaving. Ella stood there for a long moment. She looked at Leo, at the three other men staring blankly at the street at the empty cafe, and finally at the cold, untouched cups of coffee on their table. She picked up the bus tub, the metal biting into her raw fingers. Fine, Ella snapped, her voice trembling with a potent mix of fear and sheer indignation. But if you're going to sit in my dining room all day, you're buying lunch, and the sandwiches are $20 a pop for you." She turned and marched back to the counter, leaving the 4 most dangerous men in the city sitting in silence beneath a chalkboard menu that advertised a seasonal pumpkin spice latte. The espresso machine hissed again, a small, angry sound in a room that suddenly felt like a powder keg. She didn't know Dominic Moretti. She didn't want to know him. But as she gripped the edges of the counter, staring at the empty street, she had a sinking, terrifying realization. Her quiet, exhausted, invisible life was officially over. The copper kettle possessed a heavy industrial-grade meat slicer that Ella usually treated with a healthy dose of fear. Today she used it with a sort of rhythmic, aggressive meditation. Whir slice. Whir slice. The scent of roasted turkey breast and sharp, aged provolone filled the small space behind the counter, temporarily masking the permanent aroma of burnt espresso. It was 12:30 p.m. The lunch rush, which typically consisted of a dozen people shouting over each other for soup and half sandwiches, was non-existent. Instead, there was only the hum of the refrigerator compressor and the terrifying synchronized silence of the 4 men at table 3. Ella slapped 4 enormous sandwiches onto thick ceramic plates. She didn't skimp. She piled on the expensive microgreens she usually saved for the weekend brunch crowd, slathered the toasted sourdough with her house-made garlic aioli, and speared each half with a frilled wooden toothpick. If she was going down, she was going down charging $20 for a masterpiece. She carried the heavy tray out to the floor. The men didn't speak as she approached. They just watched her hands, their eyes tracking her movements with a chilling, predatory laziness. She set the plates down. The ceramic clattered loudly against the laminate. "Eat," Ella said, her voice tight, "before the bread gets soggy." Leo, the man with the broken nose, looked at the towering sandwich, then up at her. He reached into his jacket. Ella's breath hitched her shoulders, tensing instinctively, but he only produced the slim leather wallet again. He pulled out 2 crisp, consecutive $100 bills and laid them beside his water glass. "I said 20 each. That's 80. Ella said, staring at the money like it was a live snake. "Consider it compensation for the lost foot traffic," Leo replied calmly. He picked up half of his sandwich. His hands were large, the knuckles thick with pale old scar tissue, yet he held the food with surprising delicacy. Ella didn't touch the money. She turned and walked back to the counter, her stomach churning with a toxic cocktail of anxiety and profound, humiliating relief. $200. That was the electric bill. That was the gasket for the espresso machine. That was the difference between keeping the lights on next week and locking the doors for good. The money sat on the table, a bright green indictment of her own morality. She was being subsidized by a crime syndicate because she'd picked up a can of soup. The absurdity of it made her want to scream, or maybe laugh until she choked. The afternoon dragged by with agonizing slowness. The rain from the previous night had cleared, leaving the sky a bruised, pale grey. The street outside was a silent movie of missed opportunities. At 2:15 p.m. a teenager from the local high school pushed the door open, his eyes glued to his phone. He took 2 steps inside the little bell chiming above him. The sound seemed to echo in the empty room. One of the guards, a younger man with a neck thick as a tree trunk, shifted slightly in his chair. The leather creaking. The teenager looked up. He froze. He took in the 4 men, the untouched coffee cups, the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the room. He didn't say a word. He just slowly backed out the door, clicking shut in his face. Ella gripped the edge of the counter, her fingernails biting into the cheap formica. "You're killing me," she whispered to the empty air. At 4 p.m., the silence was shattered. The cafe's landline, an archaic, heavy plastic thing mounted to the wall by the prep sink, began to ring. It wasn't a modern, polite trill. It was a harsh, mechanical grating sound that belonged in a 1950s police precinct. Ella jumped her elbow, knocking a stack of paper napkins to the floor. The 4 men stopped eating. They didn't move to answer it, but their posture changed completely. The relaxed, waiting energy vanished, replaced by a sudden, rigid attention. Leo looked at the phone, then turned his slate-grey eyes directly onto Ella. He gave a sharp, single nod. "Answer it." Ella wiped her palms on her apron. Her hands were sweating cold and clammy. She stepped over the fallen napkins and reached for the receiver. The plastic was sticky with old grease. "The copper kettle," she said, her voice sounding thin and reedy in the quiet room. "Ella Madeline." It wasn't a question. The voice on the other end was a low, resonant baritone. It was incredibly smooth, lacking the rough street-level edge she expected. It sounded like old-money private schools and absolute, unquestioned authority. There was no background noise. The silence behind his voice was dense, expensive. Ella's throat closed up. She looked over at Leo. He was watching her intently. "Who is this?" she managed to ask, though the cold dread pooling in her stomach already knew the answer. "My name is Dominic Moretti," the voice said gently. "And I believe my men are currently eating your inventory." Ella closed her eyes. The cheap fluorescent light above the sink buzzed a low, irritating frequency she suddenly felt in her teeth. "Your men," Ella said, forcing her voice down, an octave, trying to find some gravel to match his velvet, "are bankrupting my cafe by existing in it." A soft, brief exhalation of breath came through the receiver. It might have been a chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "I've been informed they compensated you for the disruption, Miss Madeline. They left blood money on a table after scaring away a high school kid who just wanted a hot chocolate," Ella snapped back. The fear was still there, a cold lump in her chest, but the exhaustion was winning. She rubbed her forehead with her free hand. She smelled of garlic and despair. "Look, Mr. Moretti, I don't know how things work in your world, but I don't belong in it. I helped an old man whose bag broke. That's it. You don't owe me a debt. Call your gorillas off." "Albert Moretti is not just an old man," Dominic corrected smoothly. "He is my father, and you did not just help him with his groceries. You walked him 3 blocks through an unprotected grid during a severe downpour, while a rival faction was actively looking to exploit our temporary lapse in security." Ella's breath hitched. Rival faction. Security lapse. The word sounded absurd, like lines from a bad late-night movie, but the weight of the telephone in her hand and the 4 armed men 30 feet away made them horrifyingly real. "I didn't know that," she whispered, the fight suddenly leaking out of her. "Eyegallance is not armor, Miss Madeline," Dominic said. His tone remained perfectly even conversational, yet laced with an immovable logic. "My father is stubborn. He views my security measures as a personal insult. He slipped away from his detail. Had anyone else recognized him on that street, anyone with less charitable intentions than yourself, the outcome would have been catastrophic. You intervened. That makes you an anomaly." "I'm a barista with a failing business loan," Ella said bitterly. "I'm not an anomaly. In my world, anyone who touches my family becomes a variable," Dominic countered. "Word travels quickly. People will wonder why a civilian was walking the former head of the Moretti family home. They will wonder if you are a new asset, a messenger, a weak point." Ella's hand began to shake. The sticky plastic receiver slipped slightly against her ear. She pressed herself against the tiled wall, seeking something solid in a world that was suddenly tilting off its axis. Are you saying someone might come after me because I helped him? I am saying I do not leave variables unsecured, Dominic said. Leo and his team are not there as a reward, Miss Madeline. They are there because, until I can fully assess the situation and ensure the opposing element is neutralized, your cafe is a potential target. If they hit you, it reflects poorly on me. I cannot allow that. The sheer breathtaking arrogance of it hit Ella like a physical blow. He wasn't protecting her out of gratitude. He was guarding her the same way he would guard a stash house or a shipment. She was just another piece of inventory on his ledger. Anger, hot and sharp, flared back to life in her chest. I don't accept this, she hissed into the phone, turning away from the men in the dining room, keeping her voice low. You don't get to quarantine my life because your father wanted to buy his own minestrone. I have bills. I have a life. You pull them out, or I swear to God I will call the police. The silence on the line stretched out. It lasted so long Ella thought he might have hung up. The ticking of the large analog clock above the pastry case seemed to grow deafeningly loud. Tick, tick, tick. When Dominic spoke again, the velvet was gone. Only the steel remained. The police captain of your precinct plays golf with my uncle on Thursdays, Ella. He said quietly, if you call 911, the dispatch will route the call directly to my security director before a squad car is even dispatched. You will not call the police. You will serve Leo and his men whatever they ask for. You will lock your doors at your usual time. Ella swallowed hard. The metallic taste of adrenaline flooded her mouth. She couldn't speak. She just gripped the phone, her knuckles stark white. I do not prefer managing my affairs over the telephone. Dominic continued, his tone softening just a fraction, returning to that terrifying, polite cadence. It lacks the necessary clarity. I will be coming to your cafe tonight to inspect the premises and finalize this arrangement. Panic seized her throat. No, we're closed. I close at 8. I will be there at 8:15, Dominic said. Have a pot of coffee ready. Make it black. The line went dead with a soft click. Ella stood frozen, listening to the hollow dial tone. Her arm felt numb. Slowly she lowered the receiver and placed it back on the cradle. It made a heavy, definitive sound. She turned around. At table 3, Leo was watching her. He didn't ask what was said. He didn't have to. He simply picked up his water glass, took a slow sip, and returned his gaze to the empty street outside the window. Ella looked at the clock. It was 4:15 p.m. She had exactly 4 hours until the devil himself walked through her front door. She wiped her damp hands on her apron, the smell of roasted turkey and bleached linoleum suddenly making her intensely nauseous. She walked back to the counter, picked up a damp rag, and began to wipe down the already spotless espresso machine, scrubbing at invisible stains until her hands were raw. The hours between 4:15 and 8 o'clock didn't pass. They bled out slow and agonizing, like a punctured tire on a long stretch of empty highway. Ella found herself trapped in a bizarre domestic purgatory. She scrubbed the prep sink until the stainless steel gleamed with a sterile, blinding hostility. She swept the floor 3 times, her broom chasing invisible dust motes under the heavy, polished shoes of the 4 men who remained rooted to table 3. They didn't ask for more food. They didn't ask for refills. They existed in a state of suspended animation, their eyes performing a ceaseless, rhythmic sweep of the street outside. By 7:30, the sky had bruised into a deep, plum-colored twilight. The streetlights flickered on, casting long, jaundiced shadows across the rain-slicked pavement. Ella stood by the pastry case, staring at 24 artisanal croissants that were now officially stale. Yesterday she would have bagged them up, walked them down to the women's shelter on 9th Street, and felt a small, fleeting sense of community. Today, she just grabbed a heavy black trash bag. She opened the glass case. She grabbed a handful of the flaky buttery pastries and shoved them into the plastic. They crunched a dry, depressing sound. $30 down the drain. She grabbed another handful. $60. She threw them away with a vicious, jerky motion, angry tears pricking the corners of her eyes. She wasn't crying because she was scared, she told herself. She was crying because she was tired, because her feet felt like bruised meat, and because she was throwing away good flour and butter, because some geriatric mobster forgot his umbrella. At exactly 8 o'clock she walked to the front door. Leo's eyes followed her. The heavy lock engaged with its familiar solid clack. She reached up and flipped the sign from open to closed. The red neon glow vanished, plunging the front half of the cafe into shadowy gloom. "He's coming," Leo said. It was the first time he had spoken in hours. Ella didn't turn around. She kept her hand on the plastic sign. "I know. You should make the coffee." "I know," she repeated, her voice brittle. She walked back behind the counter, the rubber soles of her boots squeaking faintly on the linoleum. She grabbed a fresh filter. Her hands were shaking. It wasn't a subtle tremor. It was a violent, involuntary vibration that made the ground coffee spill over the edges of the filter, scattering dark brown powder across the clean counter. She swore softly, wiping the mess away with a trembling hand. She hit the brew button. The machine gurgled a loud, mundane sound that felt entirely out of place. At 8:14, headlights swept across the storefront, harsh and blinding. A sleek, heavy sedan, a dark, armor-plated monolith, pulled up to the curb, slotting perfectly into the space behind the 2 SUVs. The engine cut out, but the heavy thrum of it seemed to linger in the pavement. Inside the cafe, the atmosphere shifted. It was an immediate, visceral change in air pressure. The 3 younger guards stood up in unison, their chairs scraping loudly against the floor. They didn't stand at attention like soldiers, but they straightened their relaxed vigilance, hardening into something rigid and expectant. Leo remained seated for 3 seconds longer, a subtle assertion of his rank, before he too stood up, buttoning the center button of his jacket. The driver's side door of the sedan opened first. A man stepped out, scanning the street with aggressive speed. He opened the rear passenger door. The bell above the cafe entrance didn't jingle. It seemed to scream. Dominic Moretti stepped into the copper kettle. Ella's first thought, absurd and intrusive, was that his overcoat probably cost more than her commercial espresso machine. It was a dark charcoal wool that draped over his broad shoulders with liquid precision. He wasn't a caricature of a mobster. He didn't wear a fedora or a flashy watch. He wore the kind of quiet, understated wealth that didn't need to shout to be understood. He was taller than Leo Lena, but he carried a heavy, dense gravity. His hair was dark, threaded with premature traces of silver at the temples, combed back meticulously. His face was a study in sharp angles and exhaustion, a strong jaw layered with a faint shadow of stubble, and eyes the color of old oxidized pennies. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly, bone-deeply tired. He stopped just inside the door, taking in the cheap laminate tables, the scuffed floorboards, the flickering fluorescent bulb near the restroom. His gaze finally settled on Ella, standing frozen behind the counter, the smell of fresh, dark roast coffee blooming in the space between them. He walked toward her. His shoes' leather so polished it looked like black glass, made no sound at all. Leo stepped forward, intercepting him near the pastry case. Boss, area is secure. No movement on the street. Dominic didn't look at Leo. His eyes remained locked on Ella. Wait in the cars, all of you. Leo hesitated a fraction of a second that spoke volumes. Are you sure it's a glass front? I said wait in the cars, Leo. The voice was exactly as it had been on the phone, smooth, resonant, lacking any raised volume, but vibrating with absolute, unquestionable authority. Yes, sir. The 4 men filed out. The door clicked shut. The bell fell silent. The SUV's engines rumbled to life outside, providing a low, throbbing bass line to the sudden suffocating quiet of the cafe. Dominic stopped at the counter. He was close enough now that Ella could smell him. There was no heavy cologne, just the crisp scent of cold rain, clean cotton, and a faint, sharp undertone of something metallic. Miss Madeline, he said. Mr. Moretti, Ella replied. Her voice cracked on the second syllable. She cleared her throat, hating the weakness of it. The coffee is ready. Ella didn't reach for one of the clean white ceramic mugs she reserved for dine-in customers. Instead, driven by a petty sudden urge to equalize the space, she grabbed a thick diner-style mug from the back rack. It was dull beige, and a noticeable chip marred the rim. She poured the coffee. It steamed black as pitch and smelling of burnt earth. She set it on the counter between them, intentionally placing it a few inches out of his immediate reach. Dominic looked at the chipped mug. He didn't smile, but a subtle tightening around the corners of his eyes suggested he recognized the tiny rebellion for exactly what it was. He reached out and wrapped a large, long-fingered hand around the ceramic. He didn't take a sip. You run a very clean establishment, he said, his gaze sweeping the gleaming prep area. Though I imagine you had ample time to scrub today. Your men made sure of that, Ella said. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, trying to hide the fact that she was trembling. I lost about $400 in revenue today, plus the food I had to throw out. Dominic reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope and placed it on the counter next to the coffee. There is $5,000 in there. It covers today's losses, the inconvenience, and a retaining fee for the disruption. Ella stared at the envelope. It looked heavy. It looked like salvation and poison all wrapped in one. I don't want your money. You need my money, Dominic corrected gently. The bank holds the lien on your espresso machine, your rent was late last month, and your flour supplier put you on a cash-on-delivery basis 2 weeks ago. The air rushed out of Ella's lungs. She took a physical step back, hitting her spine against the edge of the prep sink. You looked into my finances. I look into the life of anyone who inserts themselves into my family's orbit, Dominic said, finally lifting the chipped mug to his lips. He took a sip of the scalding black coffee without flinching. I needed to know if you were a plant, a desperate woman looking for a payday, or exactly what you appear to be, an exhausted citizen who made a remarkably poor choice of who to help. I didn't know who he was. Ella's voice rose, the anger finally burning through the fear. He was a shivering old man whose groceries fell in a puddle. I didn't run a background check before I picked up his soup. I believe you, Dominic said. He set the mug down. The clink of ceramic on formica was sharp. If I didn't believe you, Miss Madeline, we would not be having coffee. You would simply be gone. The blunt, casual delivery of the threat made Ella's stomach twist violently. He didn't say it to frighten her. He stated it as a logistical fact. She was a line item on his balance sheet, currently marked in pencil. So why are you here? She asked, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. If I'm not a threat, take your money, take your goons, and leave me alone. Dominic leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the counter. The overhead fluorescent light caught the silver threads in his hair. Up close, his eyes weren't just the color of pennies. They held the dull, flat sheen of violence, kept strictly under lock and key. Because my enemies do not have my resources, but they have eyes, he explained, his tone conversational, like a professor explaining a complex equation. They saw Albert Moretti walking with a young woman. They saw that woman take him to his door. In my line of work, coincidences are extremely rare. They will assume you are a newly recruited courier, or worse, a weakness my father has developed. I make lattes, Ella choked out. I don't even own a car. Perception dictates reality, Dominic countered. If they believe you are connected to us, they will use you to get to us. They will come here. They will put a gun to your head to send a message, or they will take you apart in the back room to see what you know, which is nothing, which makes you completely disposable to them. Ella squeezed her eyes shut. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She gripped the edge of the sink behind her, the cold metal grounding her. The smell of bleach and burnt espresso suddenly felt suffocating. I can leave, she said, opening her eyes. I can pack a bag tonight. I can go stay with my sister in Ohio. Dominic shook his head slowly. If you run, it confirms their suspicion that you are involved. It makes you a priority target. And if they track you to Ohio, you drag your sister into the crossfire. Ella's breath hitched. A cold, heavy stone settled at the bottom of her stomach. She was trapped. She hadn't signed a contract, she hadn't taken a bribe, but the snare had closed around her ankle the moment she picked up that damp paper bag. So what do you want from me? She whispered, the fight bleeding out of her, leaving behind a hollow, terrifying exhaustion. I want you to continue exactly as you have been, Dominic said. He pushed the envelope of cash an inch closer to her. You will open at 6. You will close at 8. You will serve your customers. You will live your life. With 4 armed men sitting in my dining room. No, Dominic replied. That was a temporary emergency measure while I secured the perimeter. They will no longer sit inside. They will be stationed in the alley behind the kitchen, in an apartment across the street, and in a vehicle assigned to follow you when you leave this block. You're turning my life into a prison. I am turning your life into a fortress. He corrected his voice, hardening slightly. Until I find the people who are tracking my father and eliminate them, you belong to me. Your safety is my responsibility. Your debts are my debts. If your flour supplier demands cash, use the envelope. If a pipe breaks, call the number I am about to give you. But you will not run Ella, and you will not go to the police. He reached into his coat again and produced a matte black business card. He laid it neatly on top of the envelope. It had a single phone number printed on it. No name, no company logo. Ella looked down at the money and the card. It was a devil's bargain forced upon her without consent. How long? She asked, her voice tight, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerators. How long until you eliminate them? Dominic looked at her for a long, silent moment. His gaze traced the dark circles under her eyes, the flour dusted across her collarbone, the raw red skin of her hands. For a fleeting second, the cold, clinical distance in his expression cracked, revealing a flash of something that looked dangerously like regret. As long as it takes, he said softly. He didn't finish the coffee. He didn't offer a polite goodbye. He turned his back on her, the heavy wool coat sweeping the air, and walked toward the door. Ella watched him go. She watched the dark sedan pull away from the curb, leaving the street empty and silent once more. She stood alone in the dim cafe for a very long time, staring at the envelope of cash. She slowly reached out and picked up his abandoned mug. The ceramic was still warm, but the black coffee inside had already gone bitterly, hopelessly cold. For the next 11 days, Ella lived inside a terrarium. To the outside world, the copper kettle had simply bounced back from a weird Tuesday. The nursing students returned complaining about anatomy exams over iced lattes. The retired mechanics debated union politics over stale drip coffee. The register dinged. The espresso machine hissed. But Ella was suffocating. She felt the eyes on her before she saw them. It was a prickle at the base of her neck, a heavy atmospheric pressure that made the air in the cafe feel thin and recycled. Dominic had kept his word. The men in the $1,000 suits were gone from table 3. But they hadn't gone far. She spotted the watcher on Wednesday morning. He was sitting on a rusted fire hydrant across the street, wearing a faded utility jacket and heavy boots, nursing a paper cup. He looked like a day laborer waiting for a pickup. But his eyes never tracked the passing cars. They stayed fixed on her storefront. When her shift ended and she walked to the bus stop, a dark, nondescript sedan pulled out from a side street and trailed exactly 1 block behind the bus, all the way to her apartment building. The $5,000 sat at the bottom of a 50-pound commercial flour bin in the back room, wrapped in a double layer of plastic. Every time she scooped flour for the morning muffins, the plastic scraped against the aluminum scoop. It sounded like a threat. It smelled like yeast, bleached powder, and dirty, unearned survival. By day 8, the paranoia began to rot her nerves. She dropped a ceramic saucer during the lunch rush, and when it shattered against the linoleum with a sharp crack, she actually crouched behind the counter, her hands flying over her head. The silence in the cafe that followed was thick with confusion. She stood up, her face burning with a hot, ugly flush, and muttered an apology to a terrified-looking regular. That night at 9 p.m., she sat on the edge of her lumpy mattress in her cramped studio apartment. The radiator clanked a rhythmic metallic rhythm. She stared at the matte black business card sitting on her thrifted nightstand. She didn't want to call him. Calling him meant acknowledging the cage. It meant participating in the madness. But the silence of her apartment felt louder than a siren. She snatched her cell phone and dialed the number. It rang exactly once. Ella. His voice poured through the cheap speaker of her phone, a dark velvet current that instantly lowered her heart rate, which only made her angrier. "Your guy across the street needs to change his jacket." Ella snapped her voice, trembling. "He's worn the green canvas one for 3 days. Even my regulars are starting to stare at him. If you're going to stalk me, at least have the decency to use a wardrobe department." There was a pause on the line. The faint sound of a lighter clicking opened a quiet intake of breath. "I will have him rotated," Dominic said quietly. "Are you unharmed?" "I'm losing my mind," she said, the fight leaking out of her, leaving behind a raw, scraping exhaustion. She leaned her forehead against her knees. "I flinched today because a teenager dropped his skateboard outside the window. I can't live like this, Dominic. I am jumping at shadows. The shadows are keeping you alive. I don't even know what we're hiding from. You shoved me into this paranoid nightmare, and you didn't even give me a flashlight. When does this end?" The silence stretched out. She could hear the faint, ambient hum of whatever expansive, silent room he was standing in. "I located the men who tracked my father," Dominic finally said. His voice was completely stripped of emotion, a cold, flat expanse of ice. "They belonged to a crew operating out of the shipyards. They were looking for leverage." Ella's breath hitched. The immediate problem has been handled," he said, and the clinical way he delivered the phrase made Ella's stomach physically turn. "But the man who gave them the order is still unaccounted for. Until I sever the head, the body can still thrash. You remain under watch. I hate you, Ella whispered. It wasn't a calculated insult. It was a blunt, exhausted truth. She hated him for pulling her into this, and she hated herself for the deep, humiliating kernel of relief she felt just hearing his voice tell her the perimeter was secure. I know, Dominic said softly. Lock your doors, Ella. Get some sleep. The line clicked dead. Ella stared at the cracked screen of her phone, the smell of cheap laundry detergent and old dust suddenly overwhelming. She didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed and watched the headlights of a dark sedan sweep across her bedroom ceiling until dawn. The storm broke on a Thursday. It wasn't raining, but the air was suffocatingly humid, heavy with the metallic tang of ozone and impending thunder. The cafe was empty by 7:45 p.m. Ella was wiping down the steam wand, her mind millions of miles away, calculating the cost of a new water filter. The bell above the door chimed. Ella didn't look up immediately. Sorry, espresso machine is clean for the night. I can do drip coffee or tea. Drip is fine. The voice was raspy wet. It didn't belong to any of her regulars. Ella looked up. The man standing at the counter was completely unremarkable, which was what made the hair on her arms stand up. He was average height, wearing a damp grey windbreaker and jeans. His hair was thinning, but his eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, and they were dead. They didn't scan the menu. They scanned the exits. He smelled overwhelmingly of cheap menthol cigarettes, and something sour like old sweat and adrenaline. Ella's instincts, honed by 2 weeks of sheer paranoia, screamed, "The Watcher! Where is the Watcher?" She glanced past the man toward the window. The fire hydrant across the street was empty. The dark sedan wasn't at the curb. A cold, heavy stone dropped into her intestines. "Large or small?" she asked, her voice miraculously steady. She slid her right hand under the counter, her fingers blindly searching for the heavy stainless steel espresso tamper. It weighed about 2 pounds. Solid metal. "Just a question, actually," the man said. He didn't reach for his wallet. He leaned over the counter. The sour smell intensified. "You helped an old man a few weeks back. Albert. I'm a friend of his." Ella's fingers found the handle of the tamper. She gripped it so hard her knuckles ached. "I help a lot of people," she said, taking a deliberate half-step backward. "I don't know an Albert." The man smiled. It was a terrible thin stretching of the lips. He reached into the pocket of his windbreaker. "Dominic thinks he's smart," the man whispered, taking out the crew at the docks. But he left a blind spot during shift change. 20 seconds, that's all it takes. He pulled his hand out of his pocket. The matte black metal of the handgun absorbed the harsh fluorescent light above. Ella didn't think. She didn't scream. The pure animal instinct for survival hijacked her nervous system. With her left hand, she grabbed the heavy glass tip jar full of coins and hurled it directly at his face. At the exact same moment, she lunged sideways, diving behind the thick industrial casing of the espresso machine. The glass jar shattered against the man's shoulder. He grunted a sharp sound of surprise, and the gun went off. The sound was deafening, a physical blow to the eardrums. The bullet punched through the menu board above her head, showering her with white plastic splinters and chalk dust. Ella scrambled on her hands and knees over the slick linoleum, her breath tearing through her throat in ragged, ugly gasps. She clutched the metal tamper against her chest. "He's coming around the counter! He's coming!" She heard the heavy thud of his boots on the floorboards. He was moving fast. "Stupid bitch!" the man hissed, rounding the corner of the pastry case. He raised the gun. Ella braced herself against the prep sink, raising the heavy metal tamper in a pathetic, desperate arc, ready to swing at his kneecap. Before the man could aim, the front door of the cafe didn't just open. It exploded inward, the safety glass shattering into a million glittering diamonds across the floor. A massive figure hit the gunman like a freight train. Ella screamed, covering her head, as the two men crashed into the pastry case. The glass display shattered, raining down over the crushed, stale muffins. It was Leo. He didn't have his gun drawn. He had his hands on the man's throat and the wrist holding the weapon. The violence that followed was entirely devoid of cinematic grace. It was ugly, breathless, and terrifyingly fast. The gunman thrashed a wild, cornered animal, pulling the trigger wildly. A bullet buried itself into the ceiling. Another shattered the front window. Leo didn't flinch. He pinned the man's gun arm against the floor with his knee. With a sickening wet crack that echoed over the ringing in Ella's ears, Leo drove his elbow down into the man's face. The thrashing stopped instantly. The man went entirely limp, a puddle of grey windbreaker and blood on the linoleum. Ella stayed pressed against the sink, her whole body shaking violently. The smell of gun smoke, acrid and sulphurous, choked the air, mixing horrifically with the scent of vanilla syrup. "Clear." Leo barked his voice. Rough blood splattered across his crisp white shirt collar. A second later, Dominic walked through the shattered doorway. He didn't look at the unconscious man bleeding onto the floor. He stepped over the broken glass, his eyes scanning the space behind the counter. When he found Ella curled up by the sink, gripping the espresso tamper like a lifeline, he stopped. The mask of the untouchable mob boss was entirely gone. His chest heaved. His jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle ticked violently beneath his skin. For the first time, Dominic Moretti looked terrified. He crossed the distance between them in two massive strides. He dropped to his knees right there in the spilled coffee grounds and shattered glass, entirely ruining his tailored suit. "Ella!" he breathed. He reached out his hands, hovering over her, as if afraid to touch her, scanning her for blood. He saw the chalk dust in her hair, the frantic, wide-eyed shock in her face. Ella dropped the tamper. It hit the floor with a heavy, dull thud. She looked at the blood pooling around the pastry case, then up at Dominic. "You were late," she whispered. Her voice was completely broken. Dominic's face crumpled. It was a microscopic shift, but to Ella it was monumental. He didn't offer excuses. He didn't maintain his cold distance. He reached out and pulled her against his chest. Ella didn't fight it. She collapsed into him. He smelled like rain, expensive wool and ozone. His arms wrapped around her, solid and desperate, anchoring her to the ground while the world spun out of control. He buried his face in her hair, his breathing just as ragged as hers. "I know," he rasped, his voice vibrating against her collarbone. "I know. I'm sorry. I have you. I have you." She gripped the lapels of his coat, staining the dark wool with chalk dust, and flour, shaking uncontrollably in the arms of the man who had built her cage, the only man who could keep the monsters out.